Henry J. Kaiser was called America's boldest, most spectacular entrepreneur. He launched ships during World War II, manufactured steel, built the great dams of the West, developed a healthcare organization that became the model for all HMOs, and mounted the last real challenge to Detroit's big three automakers. It was a challenge that's largely forgotten today. Henry Kaiser said to think big. When he wanted to start a car company, he was determined to tackle the big three. Known as Hurry Up Henry, he set out to beat Detroit's established car makers to market with a new car right after World War II. No challenge was too big, and no one could tell him that there wasn't enough time. He always found a way. In the summer of 2004, the Kaiser-Frazer Owners Club met for its 46th annual convention in Auburn, Indiana, to remember the man who rushed to create the cars they love.
This is an excellent turnout. It's the Kaiser-Frazer Owners Club International National Convention, yearly convention. We have 118 cars here, which may not be a lot by Chevy or Ford standards, but for us it's a near record turnout for a national convention.
Right after World War II, it seemed as though Kaiser would beat the big three automakers. Eventually, he failed. But he produced cars that left a mark on the automotive landscape.
So each car has its attributes, and it's kind of nice. It's kind of like picking a favorite kind of candy. It's a little hard to do.
The public has largely forgotten these cars and the man who created them, Henry Kaiser. He was always influenced by his surroundings, starting when he was born in upstate New York in 1882.
He was from a little town called Canajoharie, New York, which is on the Erie Canal. And I think that probably had a real effect on him, because the Erie Canal changed a whole part of America. It was like a public works project that just transformed a part of America. So he could conceive of what happened when you had this giant public works project and how it really could make a real difference.
Kaiser's ambitions flowed like the canal, and he began a quest to find his life's calling. His future father-in-law told him to move west, build a home, and save $1,000 if he wanted to marry the girl of his dreams. He headed for Spokane, Washington in 1906 and found a job working for a company that supplied hardware to contractors.
And he learned the contracting business by dealing with contractors, by going to the library and reading, and then he opened up his own business. Right at the time that cars were coming along and demanding, owners were starting to form clubs and demanding good roads. Trucking companies were demanding good roads. What business did he go into? Road paving.
The growing country had an insatiable appetite for new roads, and Kaiser found a way to help. He started to earn a reputation for being able to get big things done.
Well, he built thousands of miles of roads, he built bridges, but it was all part of, this was a time when the country needed transportation, and he was right there in the industry to make the money.
The economy collapsed after the stock market crashed in 1929. President Roosevelt turned to public works projects to lift the country out of a deep depression. This put Kaiser at the interchange of the forces that would reshape the American West.
He produced the dams. He was the contractor on Grand Coulee and on the Hoover Boulder Dam. They're basic to the development of the West. You talk about the industrialization of the West. Well, you couldn't have that without the infrastructure, things like the dams.
And he was innovative too, and we lost the bid for Shasta Dam after Boulder, and Henry says, well, let's do something else. And so we built a cement plant to supply cement and all the aggregates for the building of Shasta Dam. Although we didn't build it, we sold all the material. That's how innovative he was. That's how Permanente cement came about.
The joy of economic recovery was soon dashed by the onset of war. Before the United States entered the war, Britain stood alone, trying to defend against an unrelenting German aerial onslaught. German submarines were sinking the ships that tried to send aid. They needed help.
Great Britain came over here with an order for 60 ships they wanted built. That's a huge order. And they couldn't build them in Great Britain because they were already at war. Their shipyards were being bombed. They were running flat out anyway. So they came to the United States looking for somebody to build ships for them. And of course, the United States knew that war was coming too, so their shipyards are all busy. Kaiser comes up and says, I can build ships for you.
Kaiser didn't have any shipyards. He'd never built a ship. But he knew how to build things, and he knew how to organize people and materials. He won the contract from the British to build 30 ships. While he didn't have a shipyard, he had some marshland on the San Francisco Bay in Richmond, California, near Oakland. He literally built the shipyard from the ground up, digging out a port and filling in where necessary. The shipyards attracted people from all over the country. Men and women of all races banded together to do their part for the war effort. Richmond quickly grew from 12,000 to over 120,000.
And so he built a shipyard there, and they built more ships faster than anybody in history.
He figured that there was a better way to build ships and build them one plate at a time. So, and prefabrication was the reason we built so many ships.
Prefabrication allowed more and more people to work on one ship at a time. They were building ships in 45 days, at a time when it normally took 9 months to a year to build one. To speed things up even more, Kaiser launched a competition.
30 days, 25 days, 15 days, 10 days. The winner, 4.5 days.
This was phenomenal. It allowed him to build over 1,400 ships. Kaiser didn't know the word can't. Kaiser was building ships faster than German submarines could sink them. He was turning out planes, ship engines, and munitions, as well as building airfields and military facilities. He had the equivalent of 20 military divisions, 300,000 workers employed in war production. He was an industrial general on the home front, whose optimism, inventiveness, and ability to inspire his employees helped to win the war. Finally, in August of 1945, World War II ended. Several years later, Gerard Field, founder, publisher, and editor of Scientific American, reflected on the Kaiser contribution to the war effort.
On the day after the Battle of the Philippines, when the Japanese Navy had been sunk or driven from the sea, Henry Kaiser and Admiral Vickery and I, as a fly on the wall, had lunch together at the Mayflower. And when the first martinis were put on the table, Admiral Vickery raised his, and with a tear rolling from his eye, he said, "Henry Kaiser, if there's one of our fellow citizens to whom we owe this day, it is to you, sir."
Perhaps the most enduring legacy that came out of his ability to solve large problems is the Kaiser Permanente medical care program. It grew rapidly during the war as Kaiser sought ways to provide the best medical care for his ever-growing workforce. Kaiser called on Dr. Sidney Garfield to undertake the immense task of recruiting and training doctors and setting up medical facilities to serve the thousands of workers at the shipyards. The effort caught the attention of Eleanor Roosevelt and others who saw it as a model for the nation. It was based on the idea of prepayment preventive medical care, group practice, integrated medical facilities, voluntary enrollment, and affordability. But not all of his ideas were good. Kaiser devised a system for the hospital's maternity wards called Baby in a Drawer that never caught on. He thought that instead of relying on nurses, it would be more efficient to have babies sent to their mothers via a centralized conveyor system. But the doctors and patients liked the rest of his healthcare system, and it thrived.
After the war, some of the physicians were really excited by the idea of this prepayment because instead of waiting until people got sick in order to earn their living, what they would do is they would make money from keeping people well. And they thought, that just felt a lot better.
This was the start of the Permanente Medical Group, the original HMO. Kaiser looked forward to pursuing other opportunities after the war. Many industrialists thought America would slip back into an economic depression after the war ended. They worried that there weren't going to be enough jobs for the returning servicemen. Kaiser didn't agree. He believed there was tremendous pent-up demand for consumer goods that hadn't been available in wartime. He knew people had saved a tremendous amount of money during the war, and he predicted they'd spend it igniting an unprecedented post-war boom. Returning servicemen would need hundreds of thousands of new homes, an array of consumer products, and millions of new cars and trucks. Kaiser made forays into several areas, but he'd always had a passion for cars.
He really just loved cars, and he decided during World War II to build cars.
Recognizing his lack of experience, he teamed up with a veteran automobile executive, Joe Frazer, to help him launch a new car company.
Unlike Kaiser, Joe Frazer had spent virtually his entire life in the automobile business. He had come up through the ranks of several various companies. At one point he was the president through the war years of Willys Overland and was very instrumental in spearheading the development and overseeing the Jeep.
They bought Ford's huge Willow Run bomber plant and started to gear up for production.
Huge place on a huge piece of land. It had a field where you could fly bombers in and out of and store them. I think it was the largest enclosed space in the world at the time.
Kaiser always thought big, and he was determined to beat the big three auto companies. He thought his experience building dams, roads, and ships during the war had prepared him to compete with the auto giants. He told executives in Detroit he was ready to take them on.
And he says, we've got, I don't know whether the number was 50 million or 100 million, whatever the money was, we've got that. He said this proudly, we're coming into the car business. And a little voice in the back of the room speaks up and says, that buys one blue chip. And the meaning was that you don't have enough money.
They were undercapitalized, but determined. He and Frazer jumped in. Initially, he wanted to build two distinct car lines. The Frazer, a traditional car with a six-cylinder engine, and the Kaiser, a car he once hoped would have a lightweight aluminum body, front-wheel drive, and an optional V8. But he had to scale back his ambitions and make the Kaiser and Frazer nearly identical. He was able to transform Willow Run and begin production in June of 1946. To nearly everyone's disbelief, Kaiser-Frazer became the fourth best-selling car company by 1947, ahead of the other independents, Studebaker and Hudson.
1947 and 48 were very good to Kaiser and Frazer. Production was increasing each year. They were being well received as very good and dependable cars. Numbers were good. There was an increase in dealers.
People rushed to buy the cars, as Kaiser had predicted, but there were problems.
One of the big problems that they had was with their engines, getting engines for these cars, and they were not making their own engines. They were buying them, and they ended up getting engines that were underpowered for the size cars that they had. And one of the big complaints about the Kaiser cars was that they were slow.
Kaiser was determined to conquer the auto industry, as he had done everything else. Joe Frazer cautioned his partner that the auto industry played by different rules, and sometimes it was better to let your competitors have a good year while you conserved your resources.
Mr. Frazer tried to impress upon his colleague and partner that when one was in the automobile game, that there was a give and take. And this didn't really particularly sit well with Mr. Kaiser. In fact, he's been quoted as remarking that Kaisers never retreat.
Kaiser ignored Frazer and decided to borrow enough money to build 200,000 cars for 1949. He did this even though the Big Three were preparing to flood the market with a staggering array of new cars. Frazer said this was folly and left. It had taken several years for the majors to retool after the war. By 1948, they had new cars coming off the production lines. GM executives were confident when they reviewed their new models that they could outproduce any challengers. Frazer's gloomy predictions turned out to be true. Sales plummeted in 1949 to 58,000 cars. Kaiser forged ahead, like the symbol he'd chosen for his cars, the buffalo. He kept pushing for changes. The cars were given a facelift with a wider, more massive grille, large horizontal taillights, and other detail changes. A convertible was added to the lineup. It even had electric windows. Splashy colors and improved handling set the cars apart. The Traveler Vagabond was the most interesting car. Some thought it was just one of Kaiser's wacky ideas, but it was really a first, a hatchback. This utility car had a rear door that split halfway across the trunk lid to form a hinged tailgate. It offered buyers the space of a station wagon, but it looked like a normal sedan.
It was built as a utility model, that's what we call it here in the club. And it had all uses, everything from hauling sports equipment for a football team to ambulance duty to hearse at times. Quite a novel for the time and useful modification of a sedan.
Some have found uses for their Travelers never contemplated by the designers.
A lot of comments. I love showing it off, obviously. And sometimes I worry that maybe it detracts a little from the car itself, but attention is attention, so I don't care how I get it.
Henry tried to keep interest high with a new Kaiser in 1951, the low-cost Henry J.
I see we're taking the Henry J. You bet. I'm going to leave the gas heater in the garage. Besides, the Henry J's more fun to drive. And to tell the truth, this ride circles around the other car.
Yes, owners say their new Henry J rides better than cars costing twice the price.
Henry J always dwelled on the fact that he wanted to produce a $1,000 car for everybody could have one. That was his goal. It didn't quite come out that way, but it was a small car. A lot of people didn't like it. It didn't have any frills of any kind. It was a stripped-down model, but they were a nice car. I've driven a lot.
Unfortunately, it was too little, too late. People liked its styling, but there were so many other automotive choices by 1951, the Henry J had trouble standing out. But Kaiser had one more model ready that some hoped would help save the company. The Kaiser Darin, a glass fiber-bodied roadster with sliding doors, was stunning. It was designed by noted automotive stylist Howard Dutch Darin, who'd created some of the most beautiful cars in the world, including Grand Packards and Duesenbergs.
Dutch Darin was one of Henry Kaiser's chief designers and was responsible for most of the final design work that you see here. And he more or less did that on the side, and very unbeknownst to Henry Kaiser, and introduced the car and showed the car to Kaiser. And at first Henry Kaiser didn't like it, but his wife did. And so that convinced Henry that it was not a bad idea.
The sports car market was heating up. Chevrolet had the Corvette, and Ford was working on the Thunderbird. Like the Corvette, the Darins suffered from a lack of power. People wanted their sports cars to be peppy, not just pretty. Chevrolet had the financial resources of General Motors to fix it, something Kaiser couldn't afford. But his car was an attention-getter.
This is a 1954 Kaiser Darrin, and the reason I have it is because as a teenager I saw them and fell in love with them, and finally convinced my father to get one, and we found an old one on a used car lot in Cleveland, and this is it.
He sold 435 Darins, but it was not enough. Kaiser had lost a reported $100 million in his 10 years in the automobile business. He shut down U.S. production in 1955. He was able to continue production of cars in Argentina, though the Kaiser-Frazer company was finished in the United States. But he had another car to pursue in North America. He took over production of the Willys Jeep and transformed it into a civilian mainstay. He could forego the passenger car end of the business and pursue a new market, four-wheel drive vehicles. Kaiser foresaw the need for an all-round utility vehicle beyond his Vagabond, and thought a plusher Jeep would find buyers. His Jeep Wagoneer was really the first SUV. Cars weren't his only focus. He'd acquired a number of bauxite mines and set up an aluminum company that challenged Alcoa's dominance. Aluminum appliances put Henry into every home in America, and he became a household name when he introduced his quilted Kaiser foil wrap. Some of his other ideas for the home weren't as good. His jet-powered dishwasher spun the dishes around in a circular rack propelled by water. A wonderful concept, except it broke the dishes. At the same time, Henry was undertaking a whole new series of ventures in Hawaii. His interests were broad. Even in retirement, he saw possibilities. He was a force of nature. While his cars have been largely forgotten, he changed the country. The American West had never seen anyone like Henry Kaiser. He combined vision with courage and entrepreneurial instincts. He was a leading figure in the 20th century, one of the most admired men in the world. He didn't always succeed, but even when he failed, he made a difference.